Let's pray. Father, thank you for another day to live and to learn and to acknowledge the Lordship of Christ, not only in our lives, but over this universe. And we long for the day when He will return and eventually set up His kingdom and reign and rule, and every knee bow before Him and acknowledge Him as Lord. We pray, Lord, that that day would come quickly. Even so come, Lord Jesus. We long to be free from the distractions and the sin that we struggle with, so that we could devote our whole hearts to worshiping and enjoying Him forever. But in the meantime, Lord, you've left us here to do your work in this world. And thank you for the opportunity to train and think and face challenges in a setting like this, so that we could be more effective in serving you. And that's our goal, Lord. We want to bring glory to Christ and bring others to Christ as well. So help us and use this class period to shape our thinking and give us greater understanding, so we might be more effective in the service for Christ. We pray in His name. Amen. Okay, so last time we were talking about integrative apologetics, viewing the different methodologies that we've worked through as all having some positive dimensions, all having some things that are maybe not so helpful, some challenges, and learning to view their strengths as tools in our toolbox in the process of apologetics. And someone who models that is Francis Schaeffer. We looked a little bit at his the fact that he draws on a classical approach. You remember his idea that people are lost in two ways. They're lost, do you remember the two ways? Okay, spiritually or evangelically was his term, but right. And then in the modern sense, what did he mean by that? Okay, there's a meaninglessness that people he's writing in the 20th century, so we'll use his terms. In the 20th century, of course it's still true today, 21st century, feel, because absolutes have been downplayed and God has been removed, and therefore there's this sense of purposelessness, meaninglessness. And so his answer to that is what? You remember?
Taking that roof off.
Well, that's part of it, but his answer was to show the God who is there. That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So because there is a God, this is an ordered universe. It's not all chaos and meaninglessness. There is a God who has designs and has purposes and had created us to have fellowship with Him, and thus lives have meaning and that kind of thing. But then we need to deal with the other part of the lostness, the evangelical lostness. So you see in his approach sort of a classical two-step. You establish God's world, and then you come to Christ. He was not opposed to using evidences. He challenged unbelievers and skeptics to examine Christianity based on evidence and that kind of thing. And then we're talking about presuppositions, and this is where his term, taking the roof off, comes in, where you show the unbeliever that they're actually, even though they deny Christian truth, they borrow from Christian truth. And that's like a roof over their worldview to protect them from reality of the fact that they live in God's world. So you take the roof off their system and let the inconsistencies of their worldview, whether that's in the realm of morals or truth or meaning or music or all these things, you let the fact that their worldview can't account for these things. That's what it means to take the roof off. You show their inconsistencies and help them see the truth of Christianity. Now, I've given you a handout that is an appendix to the God Who Is There. And basically, he tackles this question of apologetics. So here's Schaeffer writing, and people are discerning these at least 3 different methodologies. And so where does Schaeffer fit? And this is his answer. Let's jump in, page 175. The second paragraph there, apologetics. The answer as to whether I am an apologete depends on how the concept of apologete or apologetics is defined. First, I am not an apologete if that means building a safe house to live in so that we Christians can sit inside with safety and quiescence. Thank you. Christians should be out in the midst of the world as both witnesses and salt, not sitting in a fortress surrounded by a moat. Now, I suspect what he's doing there, part of that, behind that answer, is here you have all these ivory tower professors taking shots at him, and he's saying, hey, I'm in the real world doing the job of evangelism and apologetics. You're just in some theoretical world, so be careful. And it's a valid point. Second, I would quote what has been a part of the text of the God Who Is There on page 120 from the original edition. Here's the quote. As we turn to consider in more detail how we may speak to men of the 20th century, we must emphasize, first of all, that we cannot apply mechanical rules. We of all people should realize this, for as Christians, we believe that personality really does exist and is important. We can lay down some general principles, but there can be no automatic application. If we are truly personal as created by God, then each individual will differ from everyone else. Therefore, each man must be dealt with as an individual, not a case or statistic or machine. If we would work with these people, we cannot mechanically apply the things of which we have been speaking in this book. We must look to the Lord in prayer and to the work of the Holy Spirit for effective use of these things. In the light of this, I have been mystified at times about what has been said concerning Schaeffer's apologetics. I do not believe there is any one apologetic which meets the needs of all people. And as I said in the text of the God Who Is There, I did not and do not mean that what I wrote in that book should ever be applied mechanically as a set formula. There is no set formula that meets everyone's need, and if only applied as a mechanical formula, I doubt if it really meets anyone's need, short of an act of God's mercy. So you see what he's saying there. There's been, and we're a little far removed from the historical setting here, but there were lots of battles over apologetic methodology. And he's saying, listen, you don't just take a theory and mechanically apply it to a person as if they were some kind of robot or something. You have to realize people are different and have different questions and different personalities, so you have to approach them as a person. And yes, you use different methods, but you have to evaluate the person as a person. And that's what he goes on to emphasize in this next little bit. Maybe I'll just read a little bit of it. Jump down to where the arrow goes. When we have the opportunity to talk to the non-Christian, what if not the formula mentality should be the dominant consideration? I think this should be love. I think these things turn on love and compassion to people, not as objects to evangelize. but as people who deserve all the love and consideration we can give them because they are our kind and made in the image of God. They are valuable, so we should meet them in love and compassion. Thus we meet the person where he or she is. Go over to page 177, top first full paragraph there. What I try to do in The God Who Is There is to show that when we get to those holding the concept that there is no such thing as objective or universal truth, we can still keep talking. We can move further back and keep talking in the way they need. I do not believe that there is any one system of apologetics that meets the needs of all people, any more than I think there is any one form of evangelism that meets the needs of all people. It is to be shaped on the basis of love for the person as a person. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what he was thinking. And so what he's trying to do in The God Who Is There is address what he was somewhat prophetic, because he's writing in the, say, 1970s, before everyone started talking about postmodernism, and he recognized the reality of what was and was coming down the pipe in terms of what we now call postmodernism. And he's trying to show in The God Who Is There that even for people who reject absolutes and objective truth, you can talk to them, and that's what he was, the whole taking the roof off of their system, showing the inconsistency of rejecting objective truth. That's really what he's trying to accomplish. So that's Schaeffer. He was very influential in the evangelical world. I mean, you still all watch him in Christian Worldview, right? So though being dead, he still speaks. Okay, so that's Schaeffer. There's just one more person who I want to mention, and he's not as influential, but his concept is important to this idea of integrative apologetics. He sort of follows in the trail of Schaeffer, and that is David K. Clark. His book is called Dialogue, right? So Dialogical Apologetics. And notice the subtitle, A Person-Centered Approach to Christian Defense. I don't even know if this book's still in print, so it's not like it shook the world or anything like that. But the concept is similar to what Schaeffer's saying, that there's not a... We need to get by this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all apologetic, and recognize that although truth is one, people come to truth in different ways. So to be aware of that and to meet people where they're at. Okay, so that's integrative apologetics. Let's move on to our subject for today, and that is postmodernism. What I want to do today is to do some background work on this subject, and we'll get into the apologetics question more next time. So this might be review for you, but I think we need to at least go through the review, if it's review for you. So what do you think of when you hear the term postmodernism? What comes to your mind immediately? Jeremy?
That's a term I've never heard before.
You've never heard the term?
Well, until this class.
Okay, fair enough. So maybe it's not as popular a term anymore, which I think is probably true, especially true in Europe. They've sort of gotten over the postmodernism thing. So, and even in America, I think there's not as much discussion about it in 2009 as there was, say, in 2004.
I think of my aunt, very skeptical about everything.
Okay.
Doesn't believe.
Okay.
can't say that anything is true. Now you can't be certain about anything.
Okay. No absolutes. Everything's relative. Chris?
I don't know people who use the term, but the idea is definitely very prevalent.
Okay.
They just tell you, I'm right, you're right. What's the big deal?
Okay.
That's what it will boil down to.
Yeah, you have your truth, I have my truth.
Yeah.
We'll all just, get in a circle and meditate. Sing Kumbaya. Ana Lucia?
Yeah, kind of like going along with that. They accept what you say, they respect what you say, but they don't accept it. They just, okay, that works for you, that's good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, let me give you a few features. Postmodernism, just to talk about the term for a minute, is sort of difficult to define because it is such a broad term, and it incorporates a lot of different ideas. What we might say it's the current ethos of Western culture. Ethos, you know that term, ethos, the sort of the distinguishing character, the guiding beliefs, sort of just the cultural atmosphere that we find ourselves in. So it's because it's more of an ethos, it's hard to come down with clear definitions. So I'm just going to give you several features, and these are to varying extents. People hold these things to different degrees. But one thing is the idea of truth being subjective, not objective. What do we mean by that? Truth being subjective rather than objective. Jeremy?
Maybe that it's based on opinion instead of fact.
Okay, so the subject, the person, determines truth. Now, let's apply that to the question of religion. Okay, and what do we end up with under this concept of truth? Truth is subjective, not objective. What does this lead to in the realm of religion? Pluralism, exactly. So, all religions are equally valid. Ever heard of that? That concept? That's in the air, isn't it? All religions equally valid. Christianity is meaningful for you, then great. But don't try and tell a Hindu that he must become a Christian. That's arrogant. That's insensitive. He has his own truth. Now, apply that to texts. Apply this idea that truth is subjective, not objective. And what does that lead to? When you're dealing with words or books or texts. Sean?
Meaning is determined by the reader, not the author.
Okay. Yes. So there's the whole reader response theory to hermeneutics, where the reader determines the meaning, not the author per se. Authorial intent, we talk about that when you deal with hermeneutics. It's more reader response to the words. Now, that's maybe popular level understanding. Some more sophisticated postmodernists would say everything is interpretation. Everything is interpretation. We all bring our perspectives to the text. So I'm a white male who's lived my whole life in North America. I'm an evangelical Christian. That shapes how I read things. I bring that perspective to the text, and everyone else brings their perspective to the text. And so everything's interpretation. Someone was going to, was it Nelson? Okay.
What do they call truth?
Subjective. Well, some would deny the concept altogether. Now, this is where Schaeffer's idea of taking the roof off is helpful, because they might deny truth, but they can't live, that's not livable. Others would say, it's just your perspective is subjective. Others would say, well, yeah, maybe you can have truth in the realm of mathematics or something like that, but you come to religion or these kinds of things, and it's just all relative. Along with that is the idea that narrative or story replaces the idea of propositional truth. Okay, where propositional, certain propositions, facts, statements. Let me illustrate this from, of course, a story. This illustration comes from a novel by Diane Setterfield, The 13th Tale. And here's a quote from this book. "My gripe is not with lovers of the truth, but with truth herself. What succor," that means help, "what consolation is there in truth compared to a story? What good is truth at midnight in the dark, when the wind is roaring like a bear in the chimney, when the lightning strikes shadows on the bedroom wall, and the rain taps at the window with her long fingernails? No. When fear and cold make a statue of you in your bed, don't expect hard-boned and fleshless truth to come running to your aid. What you need are the plump comforts of a story, the soothing, rocking safety of a lie." So that's an illustration of how story is, and so, yeah, the movie industry, that's how a lot of people, movie makers, try to communicate something through the story. And they have techniques as to win you over to their perspective through telling a story a certain way. In theology, there's this whole push for narrative theology or narrative hermeneutics, where you have to look at the story and not so much the propositions, and that's where we are guided. Now, how would you react to this kind of statement?
It doesn't include how truly satisfying truth really is.
Okay. Give me an example of how truth...
We know there's a God.
Okay.
We know no matter what happens, you're going to heaven. That's bigger security than any lie or any little plump comfort story.
Okay. What does Jesus say about truth? Someone brought it up the other day. You shall know the truth. The truth will set you free. Okay? Nelson?
Deceiving yourself will only work so long until you have to face the truth at some time.
Okay. Yeah. You're going to have to face the music at some point. Robbie?
Okay. In response to your comment, to say that you find security in the truth of the Bible, when Apostle Myers responded to that by saying that is the plump comfort story that you are listening to, that is your narrative that you do.
Okay. Yeah. What would you say in response to that objection?
Look at the world. The truth, what the Bible, what you might call the Bible the story, is reflected as facts in the world. They match up.
Okay, so it's not either or. It's not story or truth. In fact, the greatest truth is a story. And there you walk through the whole redemption story, from creation to fall to incarnation, cross, resurrection, redemption, consummation. That's a story, but it's also a true story. Yeah.
I wonder if you have no truth, what else do you have? What's there to live for? You know, there's no foundation, there's no anything, and a person can't live long with a lie or even having no truth at all. They can't.
Yeah, that's right. And you can illustrate that numerous ways. And I think what you said is very true. The challenge for us as apologists is to think of examples to help illustrate that. Otherwise, we're just talking theory. So let's think of some illustrations where what Ana Lucia is saying is demonstrable. You can't live out this.
This is a pretty hard one, but it's, imagine a family that is, the husband's out every night and sleeping around, but the woman, she has to tell a lie to herself that everything's okay.
Okay.
The family's, everything's fine. And so she lives throughout her life like that, and eventually she's going to crack. She's going to explode.
Okay.
And she's searching for truth. She's searching for the reality of how it should be.
Yeah. Well, and isn't that what she's saying, though? It's more comforting to just live in the unreal world.
I think one thing, like the difference is are we living to comfort ourselves, or are we looking at what corresponds with reality?
Okay.
Because that's what truth is what corresponds with reality.
Okay.
Not just what makes us feel good.
All right. Okay.
I think that people in the world consider truth to be what they see in the world, and because they see a cruel world and an evil world, they don't want to accept that truth, because in themselves they believe that to be the truth. But the Bible shows us different. The Bible tells us of another spiritual world going on. But I think that when people see their own truth in an evil world, they would rather live a lie than to have to accept that as truth, because they don't want to.
And we could also point out that the Bible is not simply pie in the sky. It deals with the world in all its evilness, and it has a solution, a very amazing solution to it, right? In the person of Christ and the work of the gospel. Well, that's why it's good news. Yeah, Chris.
I feel like I'm often defending other Christians when we were always at fault. We always have problems within our church, hypocrisy, and it's driven so many people away. And I think the Bible does answer our questions about pain, suffering. And you turn on the radio. Like I was just the other day, I was listening to music, and every song dealt with pain, suffering, hardship. Why is the world going crazy? Different things like that. Then you turn on the Christian radio station, all they're talking about is God is love. I say, wait a minute. Let's answer some of these questions. Let's talk. This is reality. There is really pain. People are asking questions. Why don't we give them what the Bible says about pain? It's difficult to find that answer, but I think it's there, and I think that truly gives people what they're looking for.
Okay. Adam.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting that probably the only place in the world where you're going to find thinking like this is in Western civilization, where everyone's comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
The only place we see violence or really bad stuff is on movies, and we just think it is a story.
It's interesting how 9/11 briefly shook us, and then once it went away, we went back to business as usual. Yeah. Some more practical illustrations you could use. Think about the courtroom. When you are falsely accused of something, abusing a child or something horrible like that, murder, and you stand trial for that, you want truth to prevail, not some story, right? You want truth to prevail, and you want the facts out there. You don't want to live in that world, this world, when you stand trial for something like that. And so that's an example of how this sounds nice, but in the real world, you want truth. You want truth to prevail, even though it's hard truth. And that's why apologetics is really inseparable very often from evangelism, because apologetics needs to come back again and again and again to the gospel, because that's our ultimate answer, that's our ultimate defense, because it is such an amazing truth that meets the needs of people who have questions. Okay, another feature is there are no universal values. There are no universal values that apply everywhere, across time, across all geography, history. Yeah.
Is that another way of saying moral standards?
Yes, yeah. The idea here is each group, each community has their own standards, which are valid and normative for the group, but you can't impose them on other people. Okay? Now, an example that a postmodern person trying to prove that. Well, let's say the rules of the road. Is it inherently proper to drive on the right-hand side of the road or the left-hand side of the road? Well, it depends where you are, right? If you're in the U.S., you better make sure you're driving on the right-hand side. If you're in Britain or other parts of the world, you better make sure you drive on the left-hand side of the road. But that's an example of how there are no universal values. It depends where you are in the group, right? Each community sets its own standards. I saw a hand over here. No? Okay. We better not critique all these or we won't get very far. We're just giving features of postmodernism. Okay, another feature is there's more emphasis on mystery, less on logic. People are happy to live with paradoxes and tensions and don't feel the necessity to work things out. So this is a bit of a problem where when you try to take the roof off, people, they might not be bothered by their inconsistencies. Another one here is the emphasis on community is very strong, more so than on individualism. So there's a lot of interest in social history, social groups. There's the sense of relationships prevail over a sense of universal standards or duty or obligations, which is sort of a paradox in and of itself, right? Because if we take Adam's example, you should be loyal to your family, right? And when you're not, it creates all kinds of chaos and problems. And in fact, that's one of the reasons there's so much emphasis on people are longing for community, because their families are all broken up and messed up. And actually, that's an opportunity, I think, for the church in a postmodern culture. People long for community and relationship.
What's that one church called that, they come and talk about? I forget. It's more based on a community.
You're thinking of a particular church or a movement?
A movement.
The emerging church? Yeah.
That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly, the emerging church is trying to respond to all these features of postmodernism. They recognize we're living in a new kind of context, not so new anymore, but this is the context we're in, so we got to, yeah. And, you know, the emerging church is sort of a broad concept. Some will adapt all along the way, and they'll go along with some of these things, which then puts the whole Christian content in question. We're going to come to that for sure, because that's a big issue when we're dealing with postmodernism. There's a focus, for example, on victimhood, and so there's a sense in which you focus on oppressed minorities, and you try to. So you go to university, college now, and you can major in women's studies or something, and see how terrible the history is and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of talk about being hurt. Ever notice that? People talk today a lot about, oh, that person hurt me, rather than on the concept of truth, whether or not whatever they said to you was true or not. The focus is, oh, I've been hurt. That all comes out of this emphasis rather on relationships and that kind of thing, community, rather than the idea of truth. Doubt is seen as a virtue, because you can't know anything. There is no absolute, so you can't really be certain about anything. Certainty is considered arrogant. So the process of seeking is the thing, not arriving at conclusions. Now, that's going to be a problem, because the New Testament writers have a lot to say about that you might know the certainty of these things. 1 John, for example.
Is there any branch in postmodernism that says there is truth, but we just can't know it?
Yes, that would be called soft postmodernism. Hard postmodernists would say there is no truth. But soft postmodernism would say there is truth, but we can't know it because of our perspectives, our situation, our finiteness, and all this. We're going to, I think next time we'll get into that a little bit. Yeah. Now, all of these features are really a reaction against modernism, modernity, right? That's why it's called postmodernism. So all of these things are a reaction to modernism. And to understand that a little better, I want to walk through some of the development to where we are today with postmodernism. First of all, let me just clarify some terms, because these are thrown around a lot. Postmodern, the term postmodern technically refers to the time period. It's the era, the time period in which we live. Postmodernism would then be the ideology that is characteristic of that time period. You'll also hear the term postmodernity, which is more of the cultural ethos again of this time period. So, if the modern period is over, we are all postmodern, even if we are not postmodernists or embrace postmodernism, the ideology of the age, and even if we don't like some features of postmodernity. You see how those terms are used differently? So we're all postmodern. Okay, so let's walk through the stages then to see some of the historical development, and I think it'll help you get a better grasp on this whole concept of postmodernism. Let's first of all talk about the pre-modern era, the medieval period. This is a little bit difficult to date, but think of it generally as the Judeo-Christian period before the Enlightenment. Okay? The Enlightenment we'll look at next, but the Enlightenment sort of ushers in the modern era. So the pre-modern era, again, the Judeo-Christian, we're talking about Western civilization here. Now, in this pre-modern era, most people, it doesn't mean everyone's a Christian, but most people believe in a God who created the world and knows all things. So, an omniscient creator. And therefore, when we're talking about knowledge, how we know things, our knowledge is simply a small fraction of what God knows. So, in the pre-modern era, epistemology, the idea of knowledge, theory of knowledge, pre-modern, we begin with God. This is God's world. All truth is God's truth, ultimately. God providentially orders the universe. Now, this is not necessarily a perfect situation, because you have abuses of the supernatural. Certainly, this is an open universe, meaning that there's a huge interplay with the supernatural with the natural. And as a result, you have sometimes a lot of superstition, which is why the church eventually needs a reformation, because people are believing some hokey things, like you buy an indulgence and that'll get you into heaven, right? Because the supernatural was... And so it led to superstition, abuses like magic or seeing a demon behind every rock, and that kind of thing. When we move to the modern era, secondly, we usually date this around the 18th century with the rise of the Enlightenment. And this is sometimes also called the Age of Reason. And so reason is elevated over everything else. People shouldn't rely on the Bible. You shouldn't rely on what the priest tells you or the church tells you. The church tells you what to believe, what to think. No. You need to use reason. The modern science is developing, so you use a scientific method, use observation, experiment, and that's going to lead you to truth. In fact, the goal of the modern era was really to discover truth, universal truth that's going to apply across the board to everyone, and that's going to eventually lead us into being able to solve all the world's problems. We're going to be able to discover it through science, through reason, and it's going to lead us into utopia. So you don't have to write this down, but here's a statement summarizing those ideals. Modernism upheld various ideals such as the belief that humankind was progressing and could solve the world's problems. Science, the objective study of reality, would enable us to discover truth. And so what do we need? We need education. Educational and social organization would equip us to overcome the problems of crime and establish the perfect equitable state. There were right answers to every question, and we were going to find them. The Enlightenment referred to the way in which the human race was to be enlightened through knowledge, education, and would inevitably improve. Okay, so that is you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the modernist project. That was the goal. Education, knowledge, reason, science, that's going to lead us to a better world. Now, along with this, it's also anti-supernatural. Of course, rejected the concept of miracles. It promoted religious skepticism. Gene Veith says, in the modern period, human reason would take the place of God, solving all human problems and remaking society along the lines of scientific, rational truth. Now, at first, it was not necessarily anti-religious, certainly reacting to the abuses of religion, but maybe a better way to say it is not necessarily atheistic to begin with. Rather, what you had was, in many cases, deism. What is deism? What's deism?
God created in this kind of watchmaker style.
Impersonal.
Right. God sort of gets the ball rolling, but is totally aloof from the universe, not involved, impersonal maybe, just establishes the natural laws and lets them run their own course. Now, eventually you have Charles Darwin come along, and you don't even need deism anymore to have things get started. Actually, the truth is Darwinism doesn't really address the question of how things get started, but just how things develop. Now, in terms of epistemology, if modernism begins with God, pre-modernism, pre-modern time period, the modern time period begins with I, me. René Descartes, you remember his test of truth? I think, therefore I am. So I must discover truth. The concept of revelation is discarded. The idea of God or something supernatural communicating to us, that's discarded. And you see that even among theologians and biblical scholars with the rise of the higher critical methods of dealing with the Bible. It's no longer a revelation from God. It's a human product that developed over time, and our job is to, depending on whether you use source criticism or some of these other things, just see how it developed and understand it from that perspective. Now, interestingly, this period did spawn some objectors. This emphasis on science and reason and rationality, you have developing in the 19th century a reaction, romanticism and existentialism as a reaction to modernism. The romanticism is not necessarily, Valentine's Day and flowers and candy and that kind of thing, but it is the idea of emphasizing imagination and feeling and emotion and passion and that kind of thing. Okay, so you have, for example, English writers like Byron, Keats, and Shelley. You have, in music, you have Beethoven, who's composing works that invoke sentiment and passion and these kinds of things. existentialism, we talked a little bit about that last time via Kierkegaard. 20th century, this is really, Romanticism is more 19th century, 20th century existentialism develops more. And existentialism is a recognition that there is no inherent meaning in life. It's a logical conclusion really from naturalism. Yeah, if Darwin is right, then there is no meaning in life. It's just, survival of the fittest and that kind of stuff. So, individuals create meaning for themselves. You grab the moment and live for the moment. You create your own meaning. It's not connected to objective truth because there is, So actually, you can see how this leads, existentialism actually leads to concepts like pluralism, relativism. In fact, existentialism is really the philosophical basis for what develops as postmodernism. Let's move to the number 3, the postmodern era. In many ways, hopefully you can see then that the postmodern era is a reaction to or a rejection of the modern era. And really, again, it flows out of reactions that were already taking place. It's the logical, ironically, outworking of these movements. Someone has said, if anything unites postmodern thinkers, it is their reaction to modern or Enlightenment thought. But that reaction takes different forms and degrees. It's actually true of the emerging church, too. They are reacting against the ways church has been done. Including for them, the mega church movement, that's passé. You need, that's 80s, 90s stuff. We're in a new era. Okay, maybe this statement from David Harvey will help us understand. Again, that's the idea that the postmodern era is a reaction to modernism. Here's what Dave Harvey says in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity. The Enlightenment project took it as axiomatic, that is, obvious, that there was only one possible answer to any question. From this, it followed that the world could be controlled and rationally ordered if we could only picture and represent it rightly. But this presumed that there exists a single correct mode of representation, which, if we could uncover it, would provide the means to Enlightenment ends. So the postmodern reaction to this kind of perspective is, well, there's not just one right answer. It's everyone has different stories that, have to be taken into account. And you can't just say there's just one single correct mode of representation. We all have our stories to tell, and they all contribute to the big picture. And okay, so again, sorry, you had a question, Chris.
I wonder if this compares somewhat to why, while we teach evolution in all the schools across the country, only about 20% really believe it's true according to statistics. This has to do with some kind of this.
Well, it's interesting because the scientific community does not buy postmodernism, because it's a threat to them. If this is true, then it undermines what they're doing. But you're right, the larger cultural response is not necessarily to embrace evolution.
Or truth at all.
But the reason it's acceptable is because the evolutionists control the politics of it. And because it also sort of does away with God. It's interesting, postmoderns are open to any religion except Christianity. And maybe Islam, maybe. Although they're much more welcoming, at least in this country, of Islam than Christianity. Okay, so let's think about epistemology again. You have postmodernism. The postmodern era, we still begin with I, but we actually move in a different direction. Because for postmodernists, every individual is a member of a defined culture with a particular set of assumptions, different values, different languages, different ways of thinking. Okay, so each group is bound to look at things differently. So, personally, I don't see the world in the way an illiterate child prostitute on the streets in Bangkok sees the world. Right? So, here's to sketch it out, you have the pre-modern begins with God. Okay? The modern begins with I. Postmodern begins with I as well, but they move in different directions. This moves in the direction of objective universal truth, and I determine it, or not determine it, but I discover it. I am the arbitrator of it. I recognize it, and it's universal for everybody, but I'm the one that discovers it. It's not coming from God. It's not a subset of God's knowledge. It's my knowledge that I have learned through education, through the scientific method. But postmodern begins with I and says subjectivism. Everyone is a subject, and truth, therefore, is subject. And we are all bringing our perspectives. And so we look at the world from our perspective. But it's still from my perspective. So postmoderns will criticize modernity, modernists, for the assumption that there is absolute universal truths that need to be objectively applied to all people. We never have pure objectivity, reply the postmoderns. We see things from our perspective. We're not omniscient. So this means they reject something that we see from this statement. This is sometimes called a meta-narrative. That is a big explanation or a universal explanation for everything. And that's essentially what this is saying. The Enlightenment project was to get this universal truth that would, And so postmodernists say there are no such thing as meta-narratives. In fact, one of the definitions of postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives, rejecting that concept. Now, this is a problem. This is a problem that postmoderns would have with Christianity, because Christianity is a meta-narrative, right? It's explaining the world. There's one God who's created the world, and there's one way to that God through Jesus Christ, and that's the only way. So postmodernists reject Christianity and modernism. Now, you may have, we're running out of time here, but we're almost done. You may have got the impression that because of this postmodern relativism, pluralism, that we need to go back to the golden age of modernism. There's big problems there, too. What?
And free also.
Yeah. What are some problems with modernism? It's not very friendly to Christianity because it's a rejection of revelation, rejection of the supernatural. In many ways, modernism got going as a reaction to Christianity. It was its goal was to undermine Christianity. So reason, again, replaces the supernatural. That's not helpful. Now, the thing that Christians had in common with modernists was what? The concept of objective truth. Right. Jeremy?
Well, at least my experiences growing up, I seem to be around a lot more modern thinkers than postmodern thinkers.
Yeah, in the sense that they believed in truth.
And they're logical. Yeah, they believe in objective truth.
Except when you maybe ask them certain questions. Like, is it wrong to sleep around? Then all of a sudden, objective, right and wrong, absolutes are not very welcome. Yeah. Adam?
Divorce rate. People get divorced and stay married.
Yeah. Or, is Christianity true? Well, no. Chris?
I wonder if that's why we've shifted, it seems, in different ways of apologetics from evidential that would have been powerful with modernists that postmodernists really don't care about.
That's what we're sort of coming toward because, when we're still more or less largely in a modern way of thinking, you could present evidences for the resurrection, and that would be powerful because, it's either true or it's not true. Postmoderns might say, well, maybe it's true, but that's not true for me. Yeah. Now, it's interesting. Remember this statement here, how the Enlightenment Project, there's only one possible answer. From this it followed that the world could be controlled and rationally ordered if it could only picture and represent it rightly, but this presumed, okay. Now, what does that sort of sound like? What would that lead to socially? Or what did that lead to politically, socially? Communism, Marxism, right? Because the state knows what's best scientifically, and so it controls everybody's life through education. But did that lead to utopia? Absolutely not. Right? And interestingly, modernism, communism, Marxism tries to outlaw belief in God. So another illustration as to the fact that modernism is not friendly to Christianity. Instead, what happens is communism proves to be one of the most oppressive, brutal, cruel forms of government in the history of the world. So the problem with modernism, is it does not take into consideration the depravity of man and the corruption of power. So much for enlightenment, right? So much for just more education. The most educated became the most brutal in many cases.